that later on. So you were probably receiving a prompt. And welcome back to the second day of the workshop on cluster analysis for on adversarial contours. We have, as you see, Constantijn, but we also have Jeremy joining us today from Edinburgh, and I guess Constantijn, you will make introductions as well. And yeah, floor is yours. You know, I'm here for the questions in the chat if needed. But yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Max. Yeah, so welcome back. So I think I'll just briefly start sharing my screen, where I will briefly show you what's in today's schedule, what I've planned. So we're first going to listen to Jeremy. It's a great honor to have him here, and there will be immediately room for a discussion after his talk, because as far as I understood, Jeremy, you need to go and teach after your talk, right? So that's then we after your talk we will continue, and we will look at some very specific data sets using the contour clustering tool that I've been introducing yesterday. So it's going to be, at least from my end, going to be a little bit more hands-on. And if there's time left, but I leave that onto you as well, because I would like to make it slightly more interactive today. If you have questions, and especially questions concerning your data and the decisions you want to make on that, ask them. You can ask them immediately during the session. So, but if there's time, if we have time left, we're going to also talk a little bit about the perception side of things. Right. So, as I said, a great honor to have Jeremy here. So Jeremy has obtained his bachelor and master from the University of California, both Berkeley and in Los Angeles. He obtained his PhD from UCLA and did a postdoc then at Northwestern University. And currently he's employed as a lecturer in phonetics at the University of Edinburgh. And Jeremy has been working together with Jennifer Cole on the basic H-tunes of American English, and has done, among many other things, cluster analysis using k-means. So this is another method of clustering than I discussed yesterday. So I think it's great to have Jeremy here, and he can tell us all about his research. So Jeremy, the floor is yours, and it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, I'm excited to be here today and to tell you a little bit about some ongoing research, but with a focus on the methods. As I'm screen sharing here, you can hopefully all see my slides. Okay. Yes, good. All right. So yes, today what I'll be discussing is some recent research and interweaving that with some discussion of k-means clustering, which is an alternative or a different approach than hierarchical clustering. So we'll try to sort of talk both about the data and about the clustering algorithm itself. Yes, all right. So broadly then, the goals of this talk are the introduction to the algorithm, which is meant to be quite conceptual. So I will be sparing you a lot of the details of having to do with the maths behind the clustering algorithm, but hopefully give you an intuitive and sort of visual sense for how it works with some animations. And then in that same vein, I'll be talking about considerations that are important for this method of cluster analysis. And in doing so, also talking a bit about this ongoing or recent research project, which applied this clustering algorithm to time series data for American English intonational tunes. All right, so a few first things, just preliminary points to get out of the way before diving in. This work was supported by the National Science Foundation in the US, and a grant funded to Jennifer Cole, who is the PI on that project, and with whom I've been working for several years on this topic. There is also, as of today, a repository on GitHub for the code that does what I will show you today in these slides. It's currently not very well commented, but will be eventually expanded and more thoroughly made into a tutorial, which I'll post on my own webpage. So hopefully, ideally within a few months, you can return if you would like to see a more fleshed out tutorial. But presently, you can see the code for running the analyses that I will be telling you about today at that web address. And yes, also, additionally, the paper that delves into this data in a lot more detail is cited there. Collaborative work with Jennifer Cole, Stephanie Shattuck-Nagel, and Sam Chilson. And I've also included for completeness citations for the two packages in R which do this clustering analysis, and which are, at least in my own experience, fairly easy to use with a pretty low bar for entry for users, which is always good. Okay, so with all that being said, I want to begin with a little bit of an introduction to our data collection protocol, because a lot of what I'll go on to tell you about is sort of informed by this, so I think this context is important. What we did in this study was elicit intonational tunes through what I'm calling an imitative speech production paradigm with 30 speakers of American English. The study is imitative speech in the sense that they hear a model utterance, or in particular 3 model utterances on a given trial, which instantiate 8 different resynthesized F0 patterns that we've carefully controlled to have different F0 shapes or trajectories. And the 3 sentences which they heard these on are shown here on the slides. She quoted Helena, he answered Jeremy, her name is Marilyn. So each of these ends, the final word is a trisyllabic stressed initial name, and we're interested in particular on the tune. As we created it, we synthesized it on that final word. Our particular interest was in testing the autosegmental metrical model of American English intonation, which you may also be familiar with as the Toby transcription framework or labeling conventions for American English. Though I won't be talking in too much detail about the particular tunes in our case. That's sort of the basis for these 8 tunes from which we created the stimuli. So participants hear these stimuli and then they reproduce, or they're instructed to reproduce the tune on a new sentence. So the words are different, but the metrical structure is similar. And the metrical structure of the final word is also a trisyllabic stressed initial word. So the task is sort of to transpose the tune in that sense. Hence the imitative part of the task. So the measures that I'll be talking about today are taken in 30 time normalized samples over the final word only. And the analysis that I'll present here focus on each speaker's mean F0 trajectory for each of the 8 stimulus tunes. So 8 trajectories for 30 speakers, yielding 240 total in the data set I'll show you. We also did some normalization, which is, as you're now probably aware, an important consideration in cluster analysis. So we converted these measures to ERB and scaled them, or Z years and scored them within speakers to normalize for speaker differences. Okay, so that's the broad background. What you can see here at left is the straight line resynthesized approximations for the 8 model tunes shown in the different panels. So this is what participants heard. And then what they produced is at right, this tangle of trajectories, which here are colored by the stimulus tune that participants heard. So for example, the black trajectory that we're calling HHH, you can see that in these black trajectories here, which rise. And you can note at left in each panel, there's 2 lines. Those are for the 2 model speakers, which have different F0 heights and ranges. So the object of clustering analysis will be this tangle of clusters here, or of trajectories here, for which we're interested to examine sort of what distinctions emerge or are evident when we cluster within these trajectories. So with that being said, I want to step away from the time series measures for a moment and show you how k-means works in 2 dimensions, but nevertheless using the same data. So for this purpose, I've converted each trajectory into a 2-dimensional space. For illustrative purposes, I did this using what's called the tonal center of gravity model or measure, which for a given F0 event captures 2 things. So first, as shown here on the x-axis, roughly, approximately when in time, here normalized time, is F0 the highest. So you can imagine for an F0 trajectory that falls, F0 is higher at the beginning than at the end, and therefore what I'm calling the temporal tonal center of gravity, or TCOG, will be earlier. And you can imagine on the other, sort of the flip side of the equation, for a rising trajectory, the highest F0 is latest. So you see that here for these black points corresponding to these black rising trajectories here. So that's on the x-axis in this two-dimensional space. And on the y-axis is simply the mean F0 for each trajectory, which I'm calling scaled, but it's the frequency tonal center of gravity, though in actual applications of this method, this can be weighted in various ways and can be made much fancier, but here, just the average F0 for a given tune. So hopefully you can see sort of intuitively how the trajectory shapes correspond to the two-dimensional space. And for our purposes, this two-dimensional space will serve as the basis of an illustration of how K-means clustering actually operates mechanistically. So let's step through that now. Yes, I've forgotten about this slide. I always sort of like to remind myself when doing clustering analyses that the clustering method or the algorithm is blind to the sort of intended or conceived of labels for the stimuli or for the data that's being clustered over, in the sense that in our particular purpose, the clustering algorithm is blind to the fact that there were 8 different stimulus tunes which listeners heard. All right. So let's step through how K-means works. I'll show you a few sort of iterated steps, and then I'll show you an animation which will tie them together and give you hopefully a sense of how they operate. So the algorithm is iterative in the sense that it repeats the same process in iterations until convergence is reached. The starting point for every runs of a K-means algorithm is the setting of what I'll call seeds. So these are the starting points for the algorithm to operate over. They're also, the number of seeds is the same as the number of K. So you'll often see in discussion of K-means clustering, the K refers to the number of seeds, which also will correspond to the number of clusters in the eventual solution. So a critical consideration, which I'll return to, is that the number of seeds you choose to set will be the number of clusters that you get from a given run of the algorithm. So seed setting in the traditional K-means method is usually random, and I've done that here, showing you 3 randomly selected points, 2 of which are very close to each other. Though there are other methods that exist that are sort of pseudo-random or have more spaced out seed points as a starting point. Here I've chosen just 3 arbitrarily for illustration, but as I said, you could select 20, 2, 6 seeds, and so on, which is an important consideration, which I will return to. So this is the starting point. These are actual data points, which are the beginning of the algorithm's run. They are the seeds for the algorithm to run with. The next step is for each other data point in the data set to be allocated to a cluster based on their proximity to the seed. So you can see I've colored points blue that are closest to the blue seed, points red that are closest to the red seed, and so on. So this is the next step. We have points allocated into clusters based on proximity to the randomly set seeds. From here, the next step is to compute the centroids for each of these clusters, which in this case is just the mean of the 2 dimensions in this 2-dimensional space for each cluster, as you see here. So you can now note that there are 3 centroids, and points which were originally allocated based on the seeds are then reallocated, as shown here, based on proximity to the newly derived centroids. And then, as you can probably guess, the next step is to recompute the centroids, as shown here, then reallocate points, as shown here, and then recompute the centroids again, and then reallocate points into the newly computed centroids. And this process repeats in an iterative fashion until convergence is reached. And convergence here is defined as the end state where points are no longer shuffling between clusters, but the points remain stable and don't shift between allocated centroids. So here's an animation to show that process beginning to end. You can note, as I said at the outset, that 3 clusters will definitionally be the number of clusters in this clustering solution because there were 3 seeds. And you can see too, I think right about here is where we get the stable end solution. So there's definitely, as I said before, a really important consideration for k-means clustering is considering and worrying about choosing the right number of clusters, that is k, for your data set. As I said, it can be sort of arbitrarily very large, up to close to the number of points in the data set, or could be 2, or could be 4, 6, and so on. So this is an important consideration in k-means clustering, which differentiates it from hierarchical clustering. Here are 6 different solutions illustrating that problem. That is a clustering solution with 2, 3, 4, 6, 20, and 40 k, or clusters. So you can imagine in the runs of these algorithms, there were at the outset 2 through 40 seeds that began with the run of the clustering algorithm. So what this means for someone doing this method practically is that one must consider how to select or optimize for the best solution, say among this set of 6, for example. So I frame this as a problem, and it certainly is something that needs to be considered very carefully. But the good news is that there are conventionalized and relatively easy ways to do this. The general approach is to run multiple clustering k-means clustering algorithms that have different numbers of k's. So you are effectively, say, run a set of 10 different clustering algorithms with 10 different solutions, and then choose the quote-unquote best one by some conventionalized criteria. So there are various ways of selecting this best partition or best number of clusters, but the general intuition behind most of them is that this best partition is the one that optimizes both within cluster variants and between cluster variants. So you can imagine you want to maximize between cluster variants to have well-separated clusters, and simultaneously minimize within cluster variants to have relatively compact clusters themselves. So the R packages I've mentioned and used here are make this process quite easy, and will run a range of k values for you that you can pre-specify, and then they will tell you by various criteria which are the best. So luckily for someone using k-means clustering with these tools, the difficulty of trying to sort of inspect and select among clustering solutions is minimized by that. I should also note too, as I say here, that we can evaluate clustering solutions by the so-called majority vote of different criteria too. I think up to 15 in one package, one of these R packages, and based on the number of clusters that each criterion thinks is the best, you can take the majority vote in that sense. So another consideration too is that in addition to this objectively best or optimal k value, you as the researcher might have other k values of interest as informed by predictions or a theory that you're working with or testing. So for this 2-dimensional space, this was the optimal clustering solution. That is 2 clusters. Just in case you were wondering what it was, in fact, I've shown the cluster affiliation here by the point shape, so the sort of asterisks or stars versus circles, and I've shown the stimulus or exposure tune by coloration. So you can see this 2-cluster clustering solution has done a fairly good job of dividing the points in this 2-dimensional space by the exposure tunes, with one class or set of tunes in cluster 2 and the other in cluster 1. And at this point, I should also mention that though I showed you this illustration in a 2-dimensional space, you can imagine this could operate in higher dimensional spaces, like a 3-dimensional space. So it doesn't necessarily need to be 2 dimensions, say 2 acoustic dimensions. So that brings us to time series and how we translate the same sort of mechanical operation of the algorithm to time series data. The fundamental difference between time series and not time series k-means clustering is the understanding of how distance between points is computed, and between, say, a point and a given centroid, because that is critical to how the algorithm operates. So here, back in the 2-dimensional space, you can imagine this black point being a cluster centroid, and the points here, individual data points, are their proximity to that centroid are Euclidean distance in 2 dimensions. So in other words, the shortest line you could draw between the point and the centroid. Here's centroid that is time series, say a tune, an intonational tune, and two other trajectories, which are equivalent to the 2 points you see in the example at left. So the distance here is computed across the time series. In essence, there are, of course, different ways that this distance can be computed, but in essence, summing the differences at each time point. So one common way of doing this is with Euclidean distance and a formula that's essentially the same as root mean squared difference or distance, which you might be familiar with, looking at sort of pointwise, pairwise differences along the time series, squaring them, summing them, and then square rooting the sum of all those differences. So that's the sort of mathematical component, but intuitively, you can hopefully see that where their lines are longer along the time series overall, there's more distance between a given trajectory and the centroid in this case, both of which are unfurling over time. So here's just another illustration of that. The pen with 30 different trajectories and a different centroid, and they're sorted from the smallest distance to the largest distance at right. It's useful to look at here to see that whether or not, for example, the trajectory is above or below the centroid, those differences both contribute to the distances between those two time series measurements. So here, for example, in the largest difference case, the trajectory is both above and below. And here in the second largest, it's mostly above the centroid. Hopefully, intuitively, sort of looking again at the lines, you can get a sense that these distance measures, which are indeed sorting this plot here from smallest to largest, correspond pretty straightforwardly to this sort of visual difference between the centroids and trajectories. Okay, so finally, back to the data. In our data set, 5 was selected as optimal number of clusters for our data. So you see that here with this animation showing what I'm calling the input and then the output with cluster means shown there. So what I want to do in what remains of my time is talk a little bit about how we inspected the solution and thought about it in relation to our sort of fundamental central research question, which was, are these 8 stimulus tunes reliably distinguished by speakers? So one way that I think is useful to ask this question or examine this question, which is also quite, I think, readily translated to other research questions, is to look at the relationship between the clustering output and predicted differences of interest. I'll show you that here in the form of a heat map. So the heat map at left shows the proportion of each tune of the 8. The tunes are in the rows, and showing the proportion of each of those tunes that went into each cluster, one of 5 clusters in the columns here. So darker coloration and a higher proportion going up to 1 means that, for example, this tune, the one we labeled LLL, was almost exclusively contributing to cluster E. We can see cluster E is this one with the sort of slowly falling shape here. So what this reveals, of course, is the first sort of finding, which is that the number of clusters, which was optimal for our data set, was fewer than the number of tunes. And that will necessarily mean that certain tunes will be clustering together in a sense. We see that here in columns for which there's more than one row, which is dark. So these 2 tunes tended to cluster together in cluster A, these 2 in cluster B, and these 2 in cluster C. And that suggests, as it pertains to our research question, that, again, in the context of our study, this imitative speech production paradigm, those tunes, which we resynthesized to be saliently distinct from each other, are not reproduced as distinct by speakers. So one other perhaps interesting facet of this, and with using K-means clustering, is that you can look at other clustering solutions besides the optimum one, or the optimal solution. So this is the 2-cluster clustering solution, which is in essence asking what is the biggest binary distinction in the data set. We can see that here emerges as a distinction between trajectories that rise and everything else. So this could be of interest if we're thinking about how sort of what is the primary or most salient binary distinction. Of course, perhaps more interestingly, we can ask, what the 8-cluster clustering solution looks like, because there were 8 categories in the input or the stimulus step. And what we can see here is that broadly, sort of comporting with the 5-cluster clustering solution, some tunes are well separated into their own cluster. So this LLL tune, again, for example, is going into cluster D, which is shown here. But there are other tunes which are very much split across clusters. For example, HLL, this tune here, is split into cluster C and cluster G, which you see as these 2 clusters here. So sort of lining up with the other analysis, looking at the 5-cluster clustering solution, we can see not only do tunes tend to cluster together with one another when there are fewer than 8 clusters, but even when there are 8 clusters, they are not uniquely mapping to the cluster, and it's those same tunes that tend to cluster together. So that's a sort of interesting, I think, benefit perhaps of using k-means, though of course you can also look at different numbers of clusters in other clustering methods. One final thing I wanted to mention, which is something that I myself have not worked on hardly at all, but which I think is quite an interesting application of this method, is to use it to look at how individuals vary, and in this case, in their production of intonational tunes. So individual level clustering solutions can become objects of analysis. What I've shown you so far was group level aggregated data with speaker means per stimulus tune, but we can also cluster for an individual cluster just among all of their trajectories, which is what we did. And at left, you see a histogram showing the optimal number of clusters and the number of speakers that had that optimum number of clusters. And this result shows, perhaps sort of strikingly, that for 15 out of 30 speakers, so half of our participant population, 2 was optimal number of clusters, which is, of course, quite a different picture than we get when we look at the group level data. Then, of course, you could also relate this metric to other points of interest. You could look at individual traits or group traits if you have 2 groups of participants. Right here, I'm correlating the optimum number of clusters with a mutual information index, which is sort of the strength of the predictive relationship between the exposure or stimulus tunes and the number of clusters. So we see there's clearly a positive relationship, but for example, the one speaker who produces 7 as the optimal number of clusters isn't better distinguishing the tunes than speakers that produce 5, for example. So this is just to sort of signpost this is, I think, quite an interesting application of this kind of research approach to looking at individual differences. Here, which I'll just gloss over for the sake of time, are the individual heat maps, so 30 heat maps, which you could sort of squint at to look at commonalities, for example, among of the 15 speakers who produced an optimal 2-cluster clustering solution. You could see how the exposure tunes tended to map those 2 clusters. And then finally, very finally, you might be curious about how this method relates to hierarchical clustering. What I'm showing you here is just the 5-cluster clustering solution for k-means at left and hierarchical clustering at right. So with the stipulation that in both of these cases, I asked for 5 clusters and 5 clusters only from the data, you can see that the solutions are really, really quite similar. Of course, that is sort of sidestepping the question of, is 5 the best number of clusters for the hierarchical clustering solution of this data? But we can see, at least broadly, that the 2 different algorithms, though they do operate quite differently, they arrive at similar distinctions in this data set. So to conclude, I think that k-means can be a fairly intuitive way to assess groupings in the data once you see sort of how it operates. It's luckily easily translated for time series data with this particular R package that does so. And tests of different numbers of k can be interweaved with your predictions or domain knowledge. And in that same regard, it's quite easy to do this with the tools that exist in R. K-means is also said to be quite robust to outliers, which is, of course, a practical advantage. And yes, as I said, easy to examine many different ranges of k values, which helps deal with the problem of the fact that you must specify a k value to run the clustering algorithm. So in that same vein, it's sort of a double-edged sword, because for unlike a hierarchical clustering for which there's a single dendrogram that you can cut or slice at different locations to yield different numbers of clusters, for k-means, there really is one solution per number of clusters, which you must then inspect. And yes, so that makes this selection process a really crucial part of the k-means workflow, much of which can happen under the hood if you want it to. But there are, of course, as there should be, possibilities for you to intervene and think about these choices and which criteria you are using and so on. So these are, I think, the crucial considerations for k-means. And other considerations are equally important, but they're shared between clustering methods. So that's things having to do with normalization or scaling of the data, how distance is measured, and so on. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you for your time and for listening. I have a quick question in the chat, which was to repeat the name of the R package, which I should certainly do so. It's at the outset, the beginning of these slides, but the name of the package itself is the letters. I'll type it in the chat. AML. So that is the title of the R package. That does the time series clustering. Though you can also go, if you go to let me just go back to that slide, actually, as a matter of fact. And we can just see those all the way back. There we are. So here's the full citation for, at the bottom, this time series method here. And yes, I'll put it over to you if you have questions about both the method or the use, the use that we did of the method for the data and so on. And as I do have to go teach in 25 minutes, I could stick around for 10 minutes of questions or so.
All right, thank you, Jeremy. This was a great talk. So are there any questions from the audience?
Maybe I can start with a very naive question, if you don't mind. So thank you, Jeremy. This was super interesting. I've never actually run k-means clustering myself. So again, probably a very sort of introductory question, but you mentioned the examples we saw were with two-dimensional data. You mentioned the possibility of running this on, whatever n-dimensional data. I imagine, I don't know, intuitively, I imagine that the more clusters you're aiming to get, the more data you should collect, I presume. The more data you should have available, sort of a lot of other things being equal. How does that translate to sort of working with more dimensions? Do more dimensions also require you to, I understand this is maybe not a very, again, it also depends what the data looks like. I imagine how clear-cut these clusters are. I don't know, is there some general rule that you would follow?
That is a great question, and I don't have a good answer for it. I think, so the extent to which I've done k-means clustering has been with two-dimensional space, like the example I showed you to illustrate, and then also with the time series, but I have not tested it out on higher dimensional data. So yeah, I guess I feel like I share the intuition that if you're clustering in a higher dimensional space, maybe data sparsity is more of an issue, though perhaps not necessarily. It could depend on the nature of the data itself. But I'm not sure. It's a really good question and something that I'm sure someone has looked into, though I myself have not tested it out.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I might say something to that. I'm not sure whether it counts as multidimensional, but I have looked at recently at multivariate clustering. So if you, for example, combine multiple acoustic cues, so not just F0, but also intensity or other cues, would that count as multidimensional? Is it the same thing? Because I'm not sure whether I'm confusing the terminology here.
Yes. So yeah, in that case, I could imagine, and there is in fact, as mentioned here, this package KML and then KML 3D would refer to a case where you could imagine time series measures for, say, F0 and intensity which would go together. So the in that case, yeah, you certainly could do time series clustering with at least three-dimensional data. And one of those dimensions being time with k-means.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so yeah, I can definitely relate to that. So I've been recently starting to experiment with a combination of intensity curves as well as zero curves. And what you see ultimately is that your cluster analysis can pick out the differences between the words in your experiment. So I did this on data from a controlled experiment, and you don't see really the F0 differences as such, but you see a combination of F0 and intensity. So I got all my words for blue, for example, into one cluster just because they had this specific shape in terms of intensity and also influence on the F0 contour. So actually, I realized that this kind of clustering is diverting me away from the, let's say, the laboratory phonology approach, where you're interested in the difference between categories of pitch accents, for example. But it's absolutely an interesting path, I think.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, it's something that I myself, again, haven't explored this three-dimensional k-means clustering, but I think it would be quite interesting, definitely, with the data to do and compare. Yeah.
Are there other questions from the audience? If not, I was actually wondering, Jeremy, I really, thanks for the talk. I really appreciate the way you visualize the individual differences. Do you have an idea of what, because you had data from a quite controlled experiment, right? So do you have an idea of what could be causing these individual differences? Is that really speaking style still, even though you're looking at this very specific realization, which is really controlled? Or is that somehow, because I had sometimes trouble to really deal with, for example, pitch range differences, although you take normalized measures, sometimes still you get an unwanted effect of range differences. Could these things play a role? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, it's something that we've not looked at much at all. And unfortunately, with this particular data set, we didn't collect a lot of rich individual level information. So we have basic demographic information. We do have musical experience, which may or may not predict some of this variation. But beyond that, we didn't really collect any indices that we would be in a position to sort of look at how they related to these solutions. So yeah, it's something that, of course, retrospectively, I wish we had all that data, because it would be really rich and interesting to see the extent to which those different facets of individual variation contributed to this. So in our particular case, too, I think it's a real question of, is individual variation reflecting something about how the individial speaks broadly, or is it reflecting something about how they're approaching this task of imitative speech production, or both? And disentangling those things too, I think, can also be a challenge, which is sort of I guess, a blessing and a curse for this really controlled elicitation method. There's the task itself, which may be approached in various ways by different people. One of the things that I can say is that it seems like, so I have, in addition to looking at these individual heat maps, I've visualized and looked at the individual cluster means for each of the 30 people. And it does really seem like those who are producing two clusters for whom two clusters is the optimal solution. It's not that the other differences in the exposure stimuli are absent, but they're minimized in relation to this sort of whopping difference between rising and everything else. So that's sort of related to this group level two cluster clustering solution. So it's a really interesting question of the extent to which that could be related to how they're using their F0 range. In our case, it seems like so it's not like there really are only two shapes that those people are producing, but it's really sort of the stretching or exaggeration of ending high and everything else, for example. So not a totally complete answer to your question by any means, but definitely interesting to pursue. And I think, yeah, going forwards would be there's a lot to do with looking at how individual characteristics could be related to these in another round of data collection.
Absolutely. Yeah. Let's keep in touch on that, Jeremy.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah.
Sounds
Cool.
good.
Yeah. Thank you. Cool. Yeah.
Good. Any other questions?
Right. Then thanks again. Great. Thanks for joining us. And yeah, you might need a little rest. You could appreciate maybe a bit of rest before teaching again.
Little downtime. Yes, yes. Thank you all for listening. And yes, as I said, that GitHub page should be accessible now. So for those of you who want to go look at the code, like I said, it's currently not super user friendly, but you can at least see the lines of code that ran all of the stuff that I showed you today, and it will be improved eventually. Yes. So yeah, thank you all. It's great talking with you.
Cool. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right, so I think we've seen a great example, our first example of how we can apply cluster analysis to F0 data. And I realized when listening to Germany that this is one of the things that I unfortunately didn't have time enough yesterday to really introduce to you. And I'm afraid I'm going to skip that. But if there are questions about it, I'm very happy to answer them at the end of this session. So what I mean is that we kind of skipped the whole part of making our F0 data ready for clustering. And I was actually happy that Jeremy covered this to some extent. So talking about time series of zero, but this is a way that is it's not too old, let's say. So it's a relatively new technique of approaching F0 measures and F0 tunes. And I think this is something that we could definitely say more about, but yeah, let's postpone that to the end of the session. Right, so let's go back to the hierarchical part of things, and I was very happy with Jeremy's slide showing that there is no fundamental difference, at least in his data, between the hierarchical and the k-means clustering. And of course, we're looking at very controlled data with a fixed set of clusters. But it's interesting to see, and that's actually one of the things we're planning to look at together to see where we can find fundamental differences between the different clustering techniques. Because both for k-means as well as for hierarchical clustering, for example, there's many settings you can choose among, and some of them might actually divert and show differences between the different techniques more clearly than the others. Right, so for today, I hope you can all see the screen. We're going to play around a little bit with the clustering tool that I developed in the last year. So this is freely available from the website. That's also mentioned in the paper, and I can give you all the details at the end of the session. My plan is basically to show you two data sets. One is controlled speech collected with Dutch participants, and the other one is a data set from with Papua Malay speaking participants, and it's much more spontaneous speech. And they're complementing data sets in a way they're really two extremes of the kind of data you might want to look at. And it's also interesting to realize that for the Dutch data, we're looking at noun phrases, so actually words, word level or combinations of words. And for Papua Malay, we're looking at short phrases. So also the unit of analysis is clearly different. And then I would like to say a little bit more about evaluation methods, but I actually realized that Jeremy also covered a little bit how we can, find the optimal number of clusters, at least with k-means. There's different ways to go about this, so we'll try to cover that as well. Okay, let's go to the Dutch data set. So this is the stuff that you can also find on the repository, right? The URL that I gave you yesterday. It concerns data from an experiment in which participants were naming pictures. So they saw a screen with two pictures, and they just had to use one specific carrier phrase where they said, on the left, I see a green sofa, and on the right, I see a red sofa. Or like the bottom row here on the left, I see a blue snake, and on the right, I see a blue body. Right, so we tried here to manipulate where they put the focus. So either we manipulated the color, which would lead to an adjective focus, or we manipulated the shape, and that would lead to noun focus. Right, so there was actually a third condition in which there was neutral focus. So this was this is a condition that we took as a baseline, basically. Right, so in Dutch, you would expect a specific pitch accents either on the adjective or on the noun, depending on the focus, right? So this is the type of data we looked at. And so we had basically this carrier phrase. We referred to, let's say, the first mention. So the sofa on the left is basically our antecedent. And the target, where the focus is actually realized, we call the target. That's referring to the figure on the right. So we call those antecedent and target. And what we also manipulated is the position in the phrase in which the target occurs. So in one phrase, it was on the left, I see a green sofa, or it was I see a green sofa on the left, right? So it was either occurring in phrase medial or in phrase final position. So these were the conditions. So we had focus, adjective, noun, and neutral, and position, medial, final. So what we did is we did a very basic segmentation into syllables and word and praat. And we're going to look today at one sample from one specific speaker, just for the sake of the example. And also for the sake of speed, because otherwise things would take too long to load and analyze. So we're basically looking at a combination of one-way file plus accompanying text grid. And we're going to take time series of zero measures, and we're going to do this for 200 words. So we had 25 picture pairs, we had these two phrase positions and 4 words, both in the target, in the antecedent and the target, right? So adjective, noun is 4 words per item. So that leads to 200 words per speaker. So what we're going to do with the app is the time series F0 measure. So we can do this entirely in R. So there's also PraatScript available, but that's not necessarily needed anymore. So since one of the recent versions, this whole time series measuring is implemented in R. So you can do the entire workflow in R if you like. Then we're going to do some cleanup. So the data always comes out a little bit messy when you do these, take these measures. So we're going to clean up, and then we're going to cluster stuff and see what comes out, right? So we now know basically what kind of data we collected. And of course, here the underlying research question was, what do Dutch speakers do here? Do they indeed realize the pitch accents in the way we expect them to? So for the adjective, we would expect a pitch accent for adjective focus, and we would not expect, so it would be de-accented for noun or neutral focus, and then for the noun, we would expect a pitch accent for noun focus, and it would be de-accented for adjective focus, and then for neutral, in fact, it is accented, but it's the default accent, basically, so that would be a different condition. Okay, so I'm going to go to RStudio, and I hope you can all see this. So what I will show you is running the app. So this is the text that you can download from this URL. Once you load this into RStudio, you have automatically it's recognized as an application. This is built using the Shiny package. So this is kind of a graphic user interface for easy running of statistical techniques of all kind and data visualization. So it basically generates HTML that you can even load in a browser if you like to. So the only thing you have to do from here is click Run App. So if you do this for the first time, it should even work from scratch because the app is built in such a way that it will automatically give you, will install for you the packages that you need. Right. So we start with this screen. So we have basically two buttons to choose from: time series of 0 or contour clustering. This is because we can also directly go to contour clustering if we already have a data set. In this case, we start from scratch. So we start from basically all the stuff that you would basically normally do in Praat. So it asked me for a directory. This is actually slightly old-fashioned because I can't go browse here. So this is I need to kind of select this from the machine myself. That's just the way it is, and we shouldn't forget the final slash. So, and I know that in this folder I have put my wave and text grid, and I can just click read directory, and it will read the files. So I can give you a small impression. I loaded them in Praat, so this is how it looks, right? So I have a WAV file and a text grid. The text grid has 3 tiers: syllable tier, word tier, and a comment tier for when people had hesitations or when there was something problematic with the audio. And if we zoom in, we can see, for example, here, blue sofa in Dutch, blauwe sofa. And this was annotated. So on the syllable level, we didn't even bother writing anything out. We just put 1 and 2, and then it was written out at the word level. And we're going to now, for this analysis that I'm going to show you, we're going to look at the word level.
Constantijn, sorry, can I stop you for a second? It's not a big problem at all. It's just, at least from my end, your screen looks like a little bit grayed out somehow. For part of it, it's a little bit of like, darker than like white. Not sure why. Again, it's not a big problem. It's readable, but it looks like, I don't know, it's kind of like in the background, for example, and then so we might want to try and
right. I can just start the sharing again. Let me try that. Actually, I see it's also grayed out for me, but that's just because I have a window drawn around it. Is it still the case?
It still looks like that, apart from some corner, like the upper right corner. Somehow it's normal.
Okay, that's weird. So this upper right corner is where I have the controls for Zoom. Okay.
I mean, we can read everything.
Okay.
So it's not a problem.
I could continue. I can also just briefly fully log out and log back in again, because I realized during Jeremy's talk that I had a problem with the visuals as well. Like I couldn't see his whole screen. So
up to you.
Would that make sense?
Sure. I mean, it shouldn't take too long, right? So
So okay, I'll just briefly go back and come back.
Yeah. And while you do that, I can take 30 seconds to say again, I've put the website in the chat, right? Which is the website where you'll find all of the workshops and plenaries, right? So now we are trying to include or sort of expand the material that we make available for everyone. So you will find past workshops as well as future workshops, but you also will find past plenaries of events that we organize here in Constance and future events. So we have a early career conference in March. We have a few plenary speakers, and they will all be recorded and will be also made available to everybody who doesn't attend the conference. If you're also interested in this sort of making sense of categories, sort of cluster analysis approach, there is also another workshop that you might be interested in to work through, that is available now on the website, and that is Michele Gubian's workshop on modeling multidimensional time contours, where the approach taken there is of functional PCA, right? So very different approach, but also could be used to sort of tackle, I guess, similar problems, right? So I see now it looks good. So now it's looking fine, Constantijn. So
okay,
I'll leave the floor here.
Okay, thank you. Right, so we were at loading our data, right? So you have an idea of how sorry, the different files look. how we annotated them, and we're going to read this from the directory. So it just reads all the wave and text grids with the same name from this directory. And it gives me an overview here on the left, what's all in there. And I hope this is all big enough. So usually this is a bit smaller, but I can scroll here. So as for visibility. So here, the first thing the application gives me is an overview of the tiers it read from the text grids. In this case, it's just one text grid, but it's just an overview of all the available tiers that it might find. We're interested in the word tier, so we select that. And then we see a bunch of F0 related settings. So this is familiar to the plant users probably. So the basic pitch measurement settings like floor and ceiling are here. We're going for the defaults for now. We're dealing actually with a female voice, but for now we're not going to change anything. This is all all okay settings. So the time step measure is 10 milliseconds. It's also default in plant. So the more crucial settings, at least for making our data ready for further clustering, because that's basically our goal here, is to make sure that the F0 fits. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to have a look at some examples. This basically is a measure of how well the measured F0 matches so how good of a candidate that is and how strict we want to be with selecting good candidates. And the higher this number, the maximum is 1, the stricter it is. So actually 5.2 is usually not so strict. So we can play around with this value. I can show you that. Then we can select the number of measurement points. So there's basically with how many points are we going to capture our intonation contour. The default here is 20. But it's important to realize, and this is actually the little text below, is that so we now know from the app already, this is very handy information, that on the word tier, the median interval duration is 450 milliseconds. So assuming that we're going to take these F0 settings, so with a time step of 10 milliseconds, the F0 measurement resolution will be approximately 43 points per interval, right? So this is the tracking accuracy. So we know that if we set these measurement points to more than 43, we're basically doing something that doesn't give us a better quality, right? So less than 43 is still possible, but more than 43 would be weird. It would make more points out of a smaller number of actually tracked points. So it would generate information that we cannot be really sure about. Of course, we have to realize that in 450 milliseconds, 20 points is pretty accurate, right? So this is these are all 2-syllable words. So usually 20 points are sufficient. Okay, so the smoothing bandwidth is another thing we have. So basically what we need for cluster analysis is F0 contours without missing data. And usually we have missing data because of voiceless consonants or some other small disturbances, and we want to smooth over them. So this is basically how smooth of a contour we want to get out. And we can play around with that as well. So we can make it really fit our measured F0 points very neatly or really smooth over the entire interval. Okay, the app gives us an option to sample. This usually looks a little bit better in the original size, just for you to realize. And it samples by default. So here's a number in this box, which you can't see now. It samples 5 randomly chosen intervals from our text grid. So we can just run this and it will go through these self-randomly chosen intervals and gives us the output. So the output, these are basically 5 panels where we see the black lines. These are actually the measured F0, and the red line, which is the smoothed contour. And that's the red line is it would be the data that ultimately would go into our cluster analysis, right? Because we have to basically represent our contours as non-missing data. It needs to be a smooth line. Well, this looks kind of very robotic. It's a straight line, and that's actually what all it does with interpolation. So it just connects the two ends. There's a little bit of smoothing going on here, but in fact, it doesn't look too bad to me. This one, there's a contour where not much is going on, so that's acceptable. This one, probably too. Well, this is very neat. That's okay. This is also acceptable. But if we sample another 5, usually we'll find, so this is something you want to do a couple of times to really inspect your data and see whether everything is really accurate. Sometimes, for example, here we see a clear octave jump. So here we definitely want to do something about our candidates. There's actually a couple of things here that go wrong. So we usually 0.8 fit gives us much better contours. And then also the smoothing will become more accurate if the points are tracked in a more accurate way. So this looks already much better. So we're just going to go for these settings for now. Actually, what's always also possible, it's good that we have this example now, is that the detection of F0 is not detecting any F0 because maybe some intervals had problems. So the speaker had a problem, for example, or there was a problem with the microphone. Anything can happen. And if there's nothing written, nothing can be smoothed, and then you get a warning here that there was no F0 detected at all, and then you just get missing data. Well, that's okay. We can live with that. We just say measure everything you can find in the entire tier and use these settings that we just configured using the samples that we've taken. So the cool thing is that once this is running, we know that we're now basically have full control over the smoothing process, much better than when we run a praat script and have to check every time we run the script, we have to check the output. So the nice thing in Shiny is that you immediately get a visual output of what you're doing. Right, now it's done. What it did is that it gives me a data frame. It's called wide, data wide, because all the 20 F0 points are in columns at the far right of this data frame. Okay, so these are the points that represent the contour. Before that, we have some other information. We have the file information, the tier number, the tier name, the type of tier it was, the entire time of the tier, and then very important, the interval, where we can find the interval and what text was annotated there. So we can just see, this is basically all the data we need to start going to the next step for clustering. Right, so this is all we get neatly out of R. But of course, we knew that there might be cases in which F0 couldn't be tracked at all, right? So if it gets tracked, it will automatically do the smoothing and we have a complete set. But as you can see here, there are some missing data points. So it's good to be aware of this because actually not always, as you can see now, the measuring cannot always take care of these missing values, but we can do this at a later stage. So we now get the option start contour clustering with this data set. That's of course what we want to do. So it basically loads the data set that we just acquired into the interface that you can go directly to with this button that we saw in the beginning called contour clustering. And it has done some work for us in the background. It has saved the data file in a long format as well. So that's now in a separate folder from which the script is run. And we can see a first observation, which is automatically detected by the application. So we see that we have 200 contours. Well, that matches the 200 words, right, of the speaker. So that's correct. It detects, of course, it could know it because we told the app, but it will detect it from the data and it reads the columns that have F0 measures and it says, well, you took 20 measurement points. And you have data from one speaker. This is just based on the number of file names you give it. It just assumes that there's one file per speaker. It doesn't need to be accurate if this is different for your data, and it's not a big deal. You can still do the cluster analysis, but this is just basically generic information to see whether the reading works well. And we also get a warning. 840 rows are marked for error removal. Well, this sounds very dramatic, and it's not very desired, to be honest, but this means that in the long format, this means that every measurement point, So that means we have 20 rows per contour, so per interval in our text grid. That means that we have quite some contours that are not okay, that are marked for removal because they're not good to have when we start clustering. And for that reason, we can click the box here, clean data. So it removes all the missing data and F0 errors. So what it also does is usually you get a tooltip here where it gives you some explanation of what this function does. In this case, what it does is it looks at the F0 contour, and whenever the slope of the F0 contour is beyond the maximum increase or decrease of F0 that humans can produce, I mean, these limits are known from previous research, then it marks this contour as suspicious. You can still decide to leave it in, that's totally fine, but if you know that these limitations are based on thorough research, you might as well apply them. And the question is also, of course, why are they in your data? So that's something to take care about, right? So you might want to check those individual items as well. You can do this at any time, right? So from the folder you're running the app from, there's always a data file that you can check for what's going on. So you can check the individual items. Okay, we want to clean here. The other options are not relevant for now. We leave it at Hertz. We don't do octave jump things anymore. We leave this. What we might want to do is just standardize so that we have standardized the F0 range of the speaker a bit, but we in principle could leave this as well because we don't really need to correct for speaker difference just because we have one speaker in our data. Right, so it applies all of this, and now we see actually a report of what happens. So it says, okay, we have this file loaded from the time series of zero analysis that we applied. We did cleaning. We just assumed that we have Hertz values, and then for the scale we standardized it. So that's our data, and then we have the data long file that's still stored, and we have the wide file that we can actually look at right away, right? So this is the file, very similar to what we got out first. It just has a little less columns, just the most important column. So it has the file name, it has the interval label from the text grid, the start and end, and our 20 measurement points. And that's actually all we need to trace back to our original file. We have the long format in which basically the same data is just put in one line per measurement number, per measurement point. All right, so that's the status. We see now that we lost a couple of contours, right? We lost 42 contours. We had 200. Unfortunately, we lost some because, well, we had, on the one hand, we had strict F0 measurement. That could be a reason, but there were also some bad ones. Well, that's the way it is. And we don't have any rows marked for removal. So that's cool. Actually, the app is already ready to go to the next step, which is the actual clustering. So to start with, we can make a choice here for distance measure. There's a couple here. I didn't discuss all of them yesterday, and we're just going to go for Euclidean today, but it's just for you to know that there's multiple options here. One of the recent options I added is this mean absolute scaled error. This is a bit of an experimental thing. It has not been tested thoroughly on F0, but it's a very interesting and promising way because it comes from weather predicting, actually. So it basically takes one contour as the observed weather situation and the other contour as the prediction, and it kind of tells you how different the two are. And since weather data is very often time series data as well, for example, temperature fluctuations over time, or amount of rainfall over time, stuff like this, is in principle very promising stuff to apply to intonation as well. But as I said, it's experimental. So we're going safe, we're going Euclidean, and we're going for complete for now. But as I told you yesterday, there are multiple linkage criteria. And I think the most well-known ones are all represented here. There's a couple that you don't want to use maybe necessarily, but at least complete, single, and average. WARD is usually also very useful. They're all in the app. Okay, we're going for the standard settings. And the first thing we're going to do is ask for a dendrogram. And we've seen dendrograms yesterday, so I don't need to explain what that is. So this is hierarchical clustering. and it runs the cluster analysis for us and gives us some extra options for later on. But the first thing it does for us is generating a dendrogram. So for some reason, this is a little slow at the moment, probably because of Zoom. I'm on a not too fast machine, and usually this runs faster, I have to tell you. But for demonstrations, somehow these things are always a little different. Well, here we are. So it's not too problematic. We have our 156 points, I think, and our dendrogram, and we see actually some kind of late adjoinment of one single item on the far left. So this is already smells like we have an outlier. That's okay. The rest seems pretty okay. So we have a group here. We have a group on the left. So we have three kind of major groups from, let's say, from this height downwards, so excluding this single outlier, and two groups are kind of small size, and then the mid group here consists of a bigger group consisting of two major groups as well. So it's a fairly symmetrical dendrogram, which looks actually totally fine. So we have a couple of options now. What do we want to do? So I haven't talked about it, but we out of the blue we got this slider. And that's where we can set the number of clusters. It's the default set on 8, but we can change this. Because from now on, basically our job as a researcher is to make sense of this data, is to look at the dendrogram and decide, like, okay, what are we going to do with the data and with the number of clusters? What we can ask for is the table. So let's just do table. So it runs the cluster analysis, and for now it assumes 8 clusters. It's kind of the default setting. We can change this to whatever we want. When it runs the cluster analysis with 8 and it produces a table, it will give us basically per cluster an idea of how many items there are. So just the n, basically, here we are. So we see per cluster how many items are in there. And we see the mean standard error. So this is an indication of how much variation there is within the cluster. So how different from each other the contours are in that cluster. And of course, if you just have one contour in a cluster, there's no mean standard error. So and when there's one item in a cluster, these clusters automatically get flagged. So, and if something is flagged or not is the bottom row in this table. This flagging is just an additional tool for you to decide of what you want to do with those. Because usually if you have one contour clustering into one cluster, it's not very meaningful. Either you're dealing with an outlier or some super interesting contour. We never really know what's going on there. We might want to inspect this by generating a plot, but the idea of the flagging is basically that you are aware that you might be dealing with not very homogeneous data, and it's up to you to decide what you want to do with those. So the basic option that is provided by the app is those flagged clusters are here selected. And you can just say apply subsetting, which means I'm going to throw away those flagged clusters. I'm going to throw away all the observations in those flagged clusters. And if it's just 2 clusters with a single contour in them, I'm going to throw away 2 contours. That might not be very problematic for my data set, in particular if they are problematic contours. To see whether they are problematic or not, we can inspect plots. So I'm generating that now in the meantime. And the plot will show us the average F0 for that cluster. And we can see what kind of shapes come out there. Right, so this is what we see here. Right, we see a plot where we have up to cluster 6, all clusters with multiple contours in them, and cluster 7 and 8, which just had one observation. 8 indeed looks like a contour. I don't know why, but that's something we want to get rid of. And with 7, we know that with standardized data, this is very low. This is really at the floor of the speaker's F0 range, and there's nothing happening much. Of course, what I'm going to do now is apply subsetting and get rid of these data points, and then it will do the clustering again without those 2. But what you need to be aware of, and this is actually what I'm now giving an example of basically how I don't want you to use the app, is that I'm just blindly throwing away data points, which is of course a very dangerous habit. So don't try this at home. The best practice is here, and I'm skipping that in the interest of time, but the best practice here is to, if you have these flagged clusters, to see what's going on. Either you can read it directly from the plot like in cluster 8, but if you really want to be safe, for example, for cluster 7, it would have been good to just go back to the data, look which observation is in cluster 7 and see what's going on there. And maybe indeed the F0 tracking was very problematic, or it's an item where the speaker had problems in the production of any kind. And it's up to you to consider whether you want to take that data still into account, or whether you really want to get rid of it. Okay, so I decided to get rid of it, and the moment I do that, it basically throws away these 2 observations and does the clustering again. So it again is going to give me 8 clusters. It is unfortunately really ridiculously slow today, and we're going to soon solve that. But just to give you an idea, so I got rid of those flagged ones. Now the app is kind of happy and satisfied without those 2. And now we see, and that is actually a desired result in general, is that all the observations are with other observations in the cluster. So all the clusters consist of at least two observations. So the gray area around it is the standard error. We see that with more observations in the cluster, you get a slightly smoother contour. So we see some rising stuff going on. We see a couple of falls of different kinds. So the difference between 7 and 6 is basically the register. So the overall shape is not that different. With 8, it's a really clear fall over the entire word. We see something like a rise fall, and we see a couple of relatively flat contours in different registers. So we have some kind of register differences as well as shape differences, but there seems to be variance of the same kind. So it seems to be that this data set can still be reduced in terms of number of clusters. And if we go back to our data, we know that this comes from different experimental conditions, right? So we are now looking at adjectives and nouns, and they either occur with a pitch accent or without. And they occur in phrase medial and phrase final position. So we basically have, in a strictly theoretical world, we have 2 options. So we have with an accent or not, and phrase medial and phrase final, which could both affect the register and the shape. So we might just want to reduce it to 4 clusters to see whether our conditions map indeed to 4 clusters. Well, I can give you a preview here because we did this, that ultimately we ended up with 3 clusters because in 2 conditions, we got a very similar kind of contour. There is a lot of stuff that you can use in the app to evaluate this. So we're going to see this not for this data set, but for another data set. So this is can be very helpful to decide on the number of clusters. But as I will show you in the next example with the Papua-Malay data, actually when you have super controlled data, like from a production experiment with clearly defined conditions, usually the mapping of the cluster output to the conditions is relatively straightforward. So one of the things you might want to do, for example, if we look at the data, so now at the place of the interval label, what we have is just the word that was annotated there. And as we can also see now, we have an additional column cluster. So we see for the current analysis how the clusters are assigned to each of the individual observations. But what I would want to give you as a tip is that for the interval label, you could add, for example, the condition information so that you know, okay, this blauwe comes from maybe a target word that was in adjective focus, or maybe it comes from a target word that was in noun focus, so that we know kind of what to expect according to our hypotheses. So this is very useful information, and if you have that information, you can always add that, of course, because you can access this data-wide file at all times. you can add this and load the file again in R and do your comparison with the assigned clusters. So there is a button for this, so you can just say save this. So if you're very happy with this analysis, what it will do is it saves those data wide, data long, the dendrogram, it saves the table and the plot, importantly, all into one folder called saved, and that will not be thrown away, and that will be there for you in the folder you've started the app from. So this is just for reference if you want to go back to that stage of your analysis later on, so you don't have to do all the steps again. All right, so I am now going to close this and go back to our studio. So I actually tried to make the app in such a way that it doesn't give you too many warnings. We still got some warnings. That's totally fine. Usually you don't need to worry about it. Usually this whole interface is taking care of the major problems. In case you do encounter recurring errors, please contact me, because I'm currently actually working on a new version with some extra features in it that will hopefully also improve the speed, as well as some other error handling. So I'm going to change the view a little bit to actual size, because I think that will help us running the next time. So for now, I would like to see. Okay. So somebody asked in the chat, that's great. What's the 10% jump kill effect? Well, that's a kind of a remainder of the time, which actually is still an option. You can still do all the measurements of the F0 in Praat, and then you get an output file and you load that into R. That's also totally fine. And then, of course, you might know that in Praat there is this this octave jump handling. So there's a couple of advanced pitch settings in Praat, for example, that can handle octave jumps. So those occur when the F0 tracking is not very accurate, and it just jumps up an octave or down, for example. And there's a built-in check in the original Praat script for the time series measures that checks whether octave jump killing has an effect, yes or no. So it applies the octave jump killing and looks at the average F0 before and after. And if there's a huge deviation, if this deviation is more than 10%, then it will flag that contour, so you know that stuff was going on there, and then you might want to check whether this octave jump killing was accurate enough to your liking. And this is basically a threshold to say, okay, if there is a 10% difference, I still allow it, but if it's more, then I discard it, because if the octave handling has a huge effect on your contour, it might be really a sign that your original F0 tracking was very erroneous. Right, so this is a kind of a sanity check. This is the stuff that usually you don't get to worry about at all in R, because you have this interface where you can see immediately the smoothing, the effect of your smoothing that you apply. So that's actually a much more preferred workflow, I would say, at this time. There's still stuff that you want to take care of, even without the R interface, but it actually, in terms of smoothing, it gives you a much better feedback immediately before you start clustering. Right. So and actually, so both workflows still work, right? So you can do the measurement still in R, load that into the app, and start clustering from there. I'll show you how that looks for the next data set. Okay, so any other questions about this, what I showed you so far? Okay. All right, then I'm going to close our studio. Sometimes, so this is a kind of an insider tip. So sometimes the loading of the app gets slower if you load it for a second time. And then the best thing that helps, and I don't know why, but I'm going to work on that, is closing R fully and just restart it and load the app again from scratch. that usually improves the running speed. So if you encounter really slow loading times, then this would be my advice. Okay, so as I told you, and I'm briefly going to stop share and go back to another data set. So we're now going to go to the eastern parts of Indonesia, where Papua Malay is spoken. So just a second. So there we go. We have a data set collected from this language from 19 speakers, and it's these are short monologues. They're retellings of pair stories. So this is a classic movie without any talking or speech or any text, where a man is picking pears and then three boys come and stuff is happening. And a classic task is that people retell what happens in the story. There's all kind of stuff happening. So people are usually at least very vivid retellings of the story. And we have this retelling from 19 speakers. So usually there are retellings from 2 to 5 minutes long. And these retellings are very spontaneous in a way. They're monologues. And what we did is we collected all the phrases. So it's basically at the level of like larger phrases, intonation units, you could say, that occurred with a length between 600 and 800 milliseconds. So they were all of comparable size. And this is one of the, let's say, selection criteria you could apply when you're doing cluster analysis on highly spontaneous data. So I had this question yesterday of somebody who wants to apply cluster analysis to a very similar data set. So one of the suggestions is that you might want to kind of zoom into a particular kind of size of phrase so that they're actually comparable. Well, 600 to 800 milliseconds is there's still some variation, so it could still mean that there's 1 or 2 syllable difference, which could be a word difference, which could actually mean that the phrases are of a quite different kind. But the cluster analysis, by taking time series of 0, you also time warp, so you kind of abstract over the time scale. And because you do that, you can allow for a certain window of error, a certain margin of difference. But if this is too big, of course, the time warping, it wouldn't make sense to compare a phrase of 1 second long with a phrase that is twice as long, 2 seconds. So that's why we're going for a relatively small window to start with. And we chose this specific window because this is the window in which most of our intervals occur. So I'm calling it phrases between quotes because they're basically intervals in our text grid. So we're just looking at the interval length between 600 and 800 milliseconds. And it's clearly a bigger unit than the word, right? So that's why phrases would be the most accurate description linguistically. So we have 321 phrases, and what we already did is we did the measurement points. We took 20 points per contour, and we also did the standardization. So we don't have to do this. We have this data set. It's a CSV file that we got out of the the class script that is also available for the time series that I just mentioned. And what we're going to do today is load this CSV file directly in the contour clustering application. We're still going to do a bit of cleanup. We're going to do this by the subsetting function that I just showed you. And we're going to do this again in blind pruning. And we do this also to really make this set as neat as possible. This has, of course, the dangers that I already talked about before. But we're going to do this for the sake of the exercise. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the interpretation, which is, of course, a little bit of an issue with spontaneous data. Right, so let's go back to RStudio. There we are. So I hope it remains visible with kind of smaller size. So we're going to run the app again. And wait for the window to load. There we are. So here we have our first options. Now we don't need to do the time series of 0, right? We have this already. So we're going directly to contour clustering. So here we have an option directly to browse in our computer and select the CSV file. So we're going to go, this file is also in the example folder on the repository. We're going for this PMI for Papua Malay spontaneous phrases. So the pair stories. As you can see, we have our 321 contours. It's already cleaned. We don't have any rows marked for removal. That's all fine. We have 19 speakers, 19 file names. That's all correct. So we don't need to clean. And we don't need to correct for any speaker differences. Usually clean data wouldn't matter because sometimes we get errors that are removed without being mentioned here. So the status window is not always a one-to-one correspondence. So just to be sure, I click clean data again. Sorry, we are going to, no, they are standardized. So we don't need to correct for speaker differences. This has been done. The problem is that if we don't correct, the app kind of thinks that we're still using, we're still using a Hertz scale. So that's of course a mistake. So that's not the right assumption. So if something went wrong here, I'm going to briefly avoid that we're getting into slow mode. So I'm going to restart R and start again. Okay. Right, so we have what we already have in the data set is a standardized set, so we don't need to we don't need to worry about errors actually. So maybe I think that might have caused the problem here is that I wanted to remove errors that weren't in there. So I'm just going to proceed like this. Yeah, okay, so now we're ready again for clustering, right? So we have here it says no cleaning applied. It assumes Hertz now. And also for the F0 scale, which is what I just said, that's not correct because it's already standardized. All right, so we just have to live with that. Let's look at the dendrogram with the default settings and see whether we see anything that strikes us from the start. Maybe we should do additional cleaning. That could also be an option still, even though we have already a pretty clean data set. There's always maybe still jumps of some sort in there or measurement errors of some kind. I mean, if for example, Praat made an octave jump right from the start in the contour, and the whole contour stays super high or super low throughout the entire interval you're measuring, obviously what you get is a wrong contour. So that's what we had, for example, in the Dutch data with this very low contour. That's something that we still don't want, and we probably want to get rid of. Okay, so the exercise I want to do with you is blind pruning. So here we can say, okay, give us a table and then assume 8 clusters. But the blind pruning idea is basically we set our number of clusters to a really high number so that we get basically all the variation that's in our data set into separate clusters. So let's say the weird cases or the outlying cases, they will be clustered immediately into separate clusters and they will be separate from the rest. And this is a great way of pruning our data so that we get a much more homogeneous data set. We now do it blindly, but as I said, it's recommended that if you have lots of data that needs to get rid of, that you want to get rid of, it's good to see whether maybe there was a structural error in your F0 measuring of any kind. So now what we're going to do is we're going to just set the number of clusters to 32. That's way too much, probably. I mean, we don't know much about the intonational phonology about this language, but since we usually have like an inventory of maybe 8 tunes, like in American English, like the data that Jeremy just presented, or a number that's very close to that, 32 is a safe bet for overstating the variation that you might have in your data set. Of course, we also need to realize it's spontaneous speech, so there might be a lot of variation. So it's important to be well above the number you're actually, the range you're actually interested in. All right, so once we have 32 clusters, we will see that there's many clusters. As you can see here, our table is huge now. They're all marked for removal. And if we just say apply subsetting, and basically the exercise with blind pruning is it's basically pruning that we're doing, because the blind part you shouldn't do. The exercise with the pruning is we get rid of all these outlying cases until we don't find any outlying cases anymore. So hopefully what we'll see in the next step is that we have no more, or maybe just a few outlying cases left. And once we've reached a point in which we have 32 clusters where none of them is really outlying, then we know that if we were pretty safe, it's not a guarantee, but then we're pretty safe that if we go back to our range in which we expect to find the variation, something around 8, for example, that all the outlying contours are already out, and that the clustering that it has been applied, and indeed we see what we expected. We only see 2 that are marked for removal. We will then see, if we go back to a smaller number of clusters, we will see that the clustering is done on a very neat and homogeneous data set, and that the variation that's in the clusters is a very nice reflection of at least all the same non-extreme contours. Of course, there is a big risk, and that's why the blind pruning is something you shouldn't try at home, at least not when you're dealing with this kind of analysis for the first time, and especially not if you don't know your data set, is because what you might be throwing away is the super interesting cases of F0 variation. And those very particular and super interesting cases, they might be outlying for a reason. They might not be outlying because of F0 errors. They might be outlying because the speaker is super emphatic, or the speaker has a very unique pitch accent, or a very interesting tune that is applied only in a couple of contexts. So you might be throwing away the gold in your data set. So this is obviously the big risk with this method. However, it is effective, and for this demonstration, we're just going to continue with this, because you can get rid of all these outliers. So now we have, with 32 clusters, we have a kind of a clean data set. So now we could, for example, go back to 8 or 9 clusters. Right, so I hope that this method is in a way clear, and also that it's something that you might want to be careful with. And as I said before, the wide data set always allows you to see which observation ended up in which cluster, and how you might want to deal with it. Right, so before we continue with this, I want to go back briefly to what there is to do in terms of evaluation. So we haven't really talked about it. I think Jeremy touched upon some super interesting ways to deal with that for k-means. And in principle, the same kind of principles apply to hierarchical clustering as well. So we might want to apply an evaluation method of some kind to tell us a kind of an objective way, in an objective way, what would be the best way to describe our data set? What would be the best number of clusters to use here? And currently there's 2 major methods applied in the application. So we're basically trying to find with those methods what the ideal number of clusters is. And I think it's good for a moment to consider what is ideal. What do we mean by ideal? So it's efficient, so somehow it's data efficient. So we will see one of the methods that I'm going to tell you is based on information theory, and that's all about how we describe the data set in terms of information cost. So that would be a kind of an efficiency approach. Of course, the number of clusters that we're getting out of our analysis should be testing our theory. So are we indeed looking for 3 clusters because of a certain reason? So for example, the data that Jeremy had, there's 8 tunes originally. So obviously it's very interesting to apply, as he also did, at least one cluster analysis where we look at 8 clusters. So we need to test the theory. And it also needs to be intuitive. Even if we don't have a clear hypothesis, we still might want to think about, okay, now our evaluation method, just based on the data, tell us that it's 15 clusters, but actually we know that we're dealing with maybe just a handful of categories. So in a way, that intuition is very valuable to take into account in your decision on the ideal number of clusters. It should be revealing, so it should definitely give a good window on the type of variation in F0 that you have in your data. And it should be empirically solid in the way that you can reproduce and replicate what you're doing. So the app, I think, provides a couple of good steps in order to make you reproduce what's happening. And it gives you a status window that follows your steps. And at the same time, you can always, as I just showed you, click this save this button, and you keep all your data for the analysis that you did. So this evaluation that we can do gives us, let's say, an objective idea of what the ideal number of clusters is. And if we rely highly on the idea of what the best number of clusters is because of our research question, for example, does this language have, for example, 3 tones, then this evaluation method can be our key component in our analysis that will guide us to an answer. But of course, we can also think of situations where we're more exploratory as a researcher, and we just use this evaluation as additional support. And maybe this evaluation shows that multiple solutions for the ideal number of clusters, that's also possible. And this could be the case, for example, if your research question is of the type, how many tones does my language have? If you have no clue how many tones it could be because there's no literature, because you're describing a language for the first time, then this might be a much more of an exploratory approach in which you have, let's say, moderate reliance on this evaluation. Okay, so there's 2 methods. I call them U and X, and you will briefly and very shortly discover why I call them like this. So U is based on information cost. It uses the concept of minimal description length. That is basically how many bits or bytes in terms of information theory we need to describe this data, and it just looks at the one solution that has the lowest cost. And basically what we're doing with the cluster analysis is we add up 3 costs, and one is the IC, so the information cost of expressing the mean contour per cluster relative to the contour average across the whole data set, right? So this is basically the variation that you get with a certain number of clusters. Then we add to that the information contour of expressing for each contour in what cluster it is in. So this is a higher cost if it's more clusters. If it's less clusters. And then we also add to that the information cost of expressing each contour relatively to the mean of the contour of the cluster it belongs to. So that's basically a measure of how well it fits within the cluster. And usually what you get out is, so you do this for a range of clustering. So you start, for example, with 2, and then you end up with 10 clusters. And then you take the lowest cost to describe the data set. So we can actually do this in the app. And there's a button here, evaluate, and you get this window. I'll just briefly drag the window. You get these options, and here is the range you can set. So we can start from 2 clusters up to 10 clusters, and we just look in this range. We just look for minimum description length, what kind of shape we get out, and what our evaluation method then will say is the best number. So we can run this this method in the meantime. All right, so we have U now. That's going to work for us in the background. And the other one is X. So U for U-shaped, right? So you take the bottom of U as your ideal number of clusters. Then we have X. So this is basically the 2 forces that we have is within and between cluster variance. So we know, as I told you yesterday, that with 2 clusters, we're understating the variance that we have in our data, and with the maximum number of clusters is the number of observations, we're overstating the variance. So we're going to find the optimum, and we know 2 things for sure. We know that if we increase the number of clusters, the within cluster variance decreases. So the observations, they fit the clusters better. And if we increase the number of clusters at the same time, the between cluster variance increases, right? So the clusters become more separate. So the differences are better represented because we have more clusters to divide them in. And we need to make up our minds what we do with those two forces. So one suggestion is to take the optimum between both variants. So this is one of the algorithms that I think Jeremy also has applied. It boils down to exactly this exercise. So we're finding the crossing point between the within and between cluster variants, where one is as high as possible and the other is as low as possible. Okay. Right, so we can go back to this evaluation and see what comes out of the minimal description length. I'm very sorry for the slow running times today. I think that has to do with Zoom being taking some CPU resources. So I would recommend to not be in Zoom when you use the application. Actually, for big data sets, this can be definitely an issue. So the app has some bars that show the progress, but sometimes you need to wait a little bit. Okay, so our minimum description length evaluation method shows us to start with not really a U-shape. Okay, that's slightly problematic because that's all where this evaluation method is based on. This has to do with the dependency between the two F0 points. This is a bit of a technical issue, but we have, for that reason, the bending factor. So basically what this is a little bit of a rough additional tool that basically allows you to make it a U-shape if it isn't. And we can do this by lowering or increasing this number. We don't do it for now because you will get the idea. So at some point you will get a U-shaped curve out of it, and then the minimum will be the optimal point. I will just give you a brief overview of the other methods, so the within and between cluster variation. That's usually a little more straightforward. It runs slightly quicker. It does a bit less computation. But of course, there might be discrepancies, right? So it can be that the minimum description length tells you there's an optimum of 4 clusters, and within the between cluster variation tells you that it lies somewhere at 5 or 6 clusters. This can be confusing as much as it can be interesting. So it can mean that there is no real optimum and that you have pros and cons both for 4 and for 6. But it can also mean that you have one method that just represents the type of differences you're looking at in a better way. So if you're really concerned with the way you describe the data and it needs to be efficient and very neat, then go for the minimum description length. But if you are more exploratory, maybe you want to go for just an overview of the within and between variants and take the optimum, just because that's a very generic optimum that applies to virtually any kind of cluster analysis. This could be one consideration. There's actually much more to say about these, and actually there's a paper that I wrote together with Mark Ellison, who's also in Cologne, about the minimum description length. So I developed that with him, and that gives you that was an ICPSS paper of this year. Then you might want to read that if you want to know the background a little bit of that. So we see now the outcome of the within and between variation evaluation method. And we see that this suggests the optimum of 6 clusters. That's because that's the crossing point lies closest to 6. It's actually a little bit before. And sometimes you find that it's really in the middle. Of course, it will choose either 5 or 6. But if you find it somewhere in the middle and it tells you 6, then you might as well go back to 5 and see what that does, because there's no big difference in that case between 5 and 6. But you see that the between variance goes up, right, with more clusters, and the within variance goes down over more clusters, and the optimum would lie here. Okay. Now we have kind of an objective source that tells us, hey, go for 6 clusters because that's really the optimum here for your data set. Okay, then we can do this and then look at the variation in the contours we find. But we know we're looking at spontaneous data from retellings. They're phrases of all kinds. So what does it really mean, these 6? We have a handhold to start with, but the actual interpretation only starts from this point, and this can be a very long and cumbersome process, because we need to go back and forth to the individual data points, to the actual contours, and maybe see where do they come from, in which context were they uttered, what does the speaker say here and here, and why does this come out as a very particular tune, or any kind can lead to any kind of variation can lead to this specific way of clustering. So we need to start to make sense of what it could mean, 6 clusters here. Okay, so I don't think we have a lot of time to go into detail here, but I think it might be good that you see an example of maybe one of the utterances that I clustered in this specific data set that we're looking at now, and that kind of led me to conclude that cluster analysis is the way to go. And I think it would be nice to have this. I'm briefly going to show you the PDF with that specific example in it, because I think it makes sense. So there's one example where here, for example. So I hope you can all see this very well. So here we have a rise on the word jambu, and jambu in Papua Malay means rose apple. And this is a word that this speaker in this specific pear story used to describe an apple, because, to describe a pear, because the story is about pears. And in Papua Malay, they don't really have the word for pear. So it was just a description, just a word that they used for this. And the interesting thing is that this occurrence, that this contour was clustering with all kinds of rises that I always found, or tend to find, on words like "and then," because people are telling a story, right? So they have some kind of continuation words to indicate these. So things like "and then" and "after that." And then at some point, I see jambu in this collection in the same cluster. But then I see that there is indeed a rise on jambu. And then I go to the specific example. And then I see that this jambu is uttered for the second or third time by the speaker. And it's basically used as a continuation, because the speaker keeps the floor and continues to talk about rose apples. But it's basically just a placeholder for continuation. Just repeating a word that had been salient in the previous context, because the speaker was searching for the specific word. And that's where I realized that, okay, so here we really have a decoupling of the shape of a contour, where the shape matters because it signals continuation, and it doesn't really matter on which kind of segments you realize as contours. So then I thought, okay, if I can get out this nice result from clustering, then I think clustering is the way to go. So this was, for me, closes the loop between cleaning my F0 contours, going for clustering, trying to make sense, and then ultimately see an example and fully understand what the cluster analysis did to, let's say, the meaning of my specific rising contour. So I think this is maybe the point where I need to stop. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. And I haven't talked too much about perceptions. This is definitely something that could be covered as well. But I think I should stop here and leave the floor to you to ask whatever you want to know. Yeah, so I see Elena has a question.
Yeah, hi. I have many questions, but maybe the main one right now is, how can I select phrase lengths? Is this a thing in Praat or?
Yeah. So this was an option in the Praat script that gives you explicitly, you can define a range in terms of milliseconds. So that would be definitely, if you want to do this, and I think for your data, this might apply indeed, that you want to take a similar window, maybe 600 to 800 milliseconds or something. This is a setting in the Praat script indeed. What you can do also is still do all the measurements in R and then do the selection of length yourself, because you get the timestamps from the start and the end of the interval for each observation.
Okay, yeah, that might be good, because always in the beginning of a recording, I have some something in the non-target language where I explain what's going on and please start talking, and then they say, okay, thank you. And then, you know,
Yeah.
they actually, so anyway, and the Praat script, is this online somewhere?
Yeah, it's all online. So it's I'll post the URL in the
Okay, thanks.
in the chat. And that's actually also where you find the application and all the documentation, and also an overview of all the papers that have applied this method already. So there's a growing body of languages and people are still doing it. And I'm always very, very interested to know what people are doing. And you'll find a manual as well on the website. So that's also helps you to get started with most of the technical issues. So there you go. So there's definitely more room for questions.
So while questions come in, I just wanted to thank you, Constantijn, for the workshop. It was really, really great, and great to get such a good overview of all of this, from sort of a very simple example to actually practically doing this, you know, on research that concerns us linguists in particular, and also with Jeremy's intervention, which also gave a different sort of perspective to a different approach. So really, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would just stop the recording.